A guard spotted a bear cub struggling for its life in an icy river. Without hesitation, he rescued it. But what happened when the mother bear appeared was so moving that he couldn't hold back his tears. The morning sun painted Yellowstone National Park in hues of amber and gold as Jake Turner adjusted the badge on his ranger uniform. His fingers traced the metallic surface, still unfamiliar with its weight and the responsibility it carried. The vast expanse of wilderness before him seemed both inviting and intimidating, a maze of ancient trees, hidden valleys, and untamed beauty that would now be under his protection. At 26, Jake was the newest addition to Yellowstone's ranger team. The position had been his dream since childhood, but now that he stood at the threshold of this massive natural sanctuary, reality felt far more overwhelming than any dream. The crisp mountain air filled his lungs as he took his first steps into what would become the most transformative journey of his life. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. Remember, Turner, always expect the unexpected, Senior Ranger Martinez had told him during orientation. Those words echoed in his mind as he began his first solo patrol, mapping out the day's route in his head. The morning dew still clung to the grass, and the forest was alive with the sounds of awakening wildlife. The trail before him wound through dense pine forests, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the park's legendary landscape. Jake had studied maps and guidelines extensively, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw majesty of actually being there, responsible for protecting this pristine wilderness and its inhabitants. As he hiked deeper into his assigned sector, Jake noticed subtle signs of the forest's daily rhythm: deer tracks crossing the path, berry bushes recently grazed by bears, and the distant call of eagles. His trained eye caught details that most visitors would miss, but each observation only emphasized how much more he had to learn about this vast ecosystem. The morning passed quietly as Jake familiarized himself with his route, making mental notes of landmarks and potential areas that might need closer monitoring. It wasn't until early afternoon that the peace of his first patrol was shattered by a sound that would change everything, a desperate cry that seemed to echo through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable tone of distress. Jake froze, his senses suddenly alert. The cry came again, this time clearer, coming from the direction of the river. Without hesitation, he veered off his planned route, moving quickly but carefully through the underbrush. The sound grew louder as he approached the river, its waters swollen from recent rains. Breaking through the tree line, Jake's heart nearly stopped at the sight before him. In the churning waters of the river, a small bear cub was fighting against the current, its tiny paws thrashing helplessly as the water threatened to pull it under. Time seemed to slow as Jake's training and instincts collided with the reality of what he was witnessing. In those crucial moments, everything he had learned about wildlife management and personal safety screamed at him to follow protocol, to call for backup, to assess the situation from a safe distance, to wait for support. But something deeper, more primitive than his training took hold as he watched the cub's strength beginning to fade. The river's roar filled his ears as Jake made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events he could never have anticipated. Without removing his heavy boots or utility belt, he plunged into the icy waters. The current immediately tried to sweep his feet out from under him, but Jake had grown up swimming in mountain streams. He fought against the force of the water, keeping his eyes fixed on the struggling cub. The cold bit through his uniform, and the weight of his gear threatened to drag him down, but Jake pressed forward. The cub's movements were becoming weaker, its small head barely staying above water. With powerful strokes, Jake closed the distance, his mind focused solely on reaching the animal before it was too late. As he got closer, he could see the fear in the cub's eyes, a primal terror that transcended the natural barriers between species. The current pushed the cub toward him, and Jake seized his chance. With one arm, he managed to secure the small body against his chest, while using his other arm to fight against the river's pull. The journey back to shore seemed to take an eternity. Every stroke was a battle against exhaustion and the relentless force of the water. The cub, surprisingly, remained still in his grasp, as if understanding that its survival depended on this strange human's strength. Finally, Jake's feet found purchase on the riverbed, and he staggered toward the bank, his legs shaking with cold and exertion. Collapsing on the shore, Jake gently laid the cub on the ground. The small bear was trembling, its fur matted against its body, but it was breathing steadily. As Jake caught his breath, the magnitude of what he had just done began to sink in. He had broken at least a dozen protocols, risked his own life, and intervened directly in a natural situation, all on his first day of solo patrol. As he examined the cub for injuries, a sensation crept up his spine, that peculiar awareness that comes from being watched. Slowly, Jake raised his head, his eyes scanning the tree line. There, partially hidden by the shadows of the forest, stood a sight that made his blood freeze faster than the river water had. A full-grown female bear was watching them, her eyes fixed intently on the scene before her. Jake's mind raced through his training, calculating distances and escape routes, but something about the bear's demeanor made him pause. She was favoring one leg, clearly injured, but her focus seemed split between her cub and the human who had saved it. The moment hung suspended in time, a tableau of wild and civilized worlds meeting in an unexpected intersection of fate. Human and bear locked eyes across the clearing, and in that moment, Jake Turner understood that his life as a ranger would be nothing like he had imagined. This was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about wildlife, about nature, and about himself. In the tense moments that followed, Jake remained perfectly still, his ranger training warring with an inexplicable instinct that told him this encounter was different. The mother bear's eyes held something he had never seen before in a wild animal, a mix of wariness and what appeared to be recognition. She limped forward slightly, her injury more apparent with each careful step. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he watched her approach. The cub, still trembling from its ordeal, made a soft whimpering sound that seemed to echo across the clearing. The mother's ears twitched at the noise, but her gaze remained fixed on Jake. He could see now that her injury was serious, a deep gash on her hind leg that explained why she hadn't been able to rescue her cub herself. With movements so slow they were barely perceptible, Jake began to back away from the cub. His heart pounded in his chest, but not from fear. There was something profound happening here, something that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild animal. The mother bear watched his retreat with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through him. Once he had put enough distance between himself and the cub, the mother bear moved forward. With surprising gentleness, she picked up her offspring by the scruff of its neck, but instead of immediately disappearing into the forest, she paused. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she turned her head and met Jake's gaze one final time. The look in her eyes would haunt him for days to come. It was almost as if she was memorizing his face. As the bears disappeared into the dense undergrowth, Jake remained rooted to the spot, water still dripping from his uniform. The entire encounter had lasted only minutes, but he knew he had just experienced something extraordinary. His training had taught him about the unpredictability of wildlife, about maintaining professional distance, about never anthropomorphizing their behavior. But nothing had prepared him for the connection he had just felt. Back at his ranger station that evening, Jake struggled to properly document the incident in his daily report. How could he describe what had transpired without sounding like he had lost his mind? He stared at the blank form on his computer screen, cursor blinking accusingly. Finally, he settled for a straightforward account of rescuing the cub, mentioning the mother bear's presence, but omitting the inexplicable moment of connection they had shared. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mother bear's penetrating gaze. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a random incident. It felt like the beginning of something. His small cabin, usually a comfort after a long day's patrol, felt somehow different, as if the wilderness he had sworn to protect had followed him home. The next few days passed in a blur of routine patrols, but Jake found himself drawn back to the area where he had rescued the cub. Each time he approached the river, he noticed subtle signs that suggested the bears were still in the vicinity. Fresh tracks in the mud, recently disturbed berry bushes, and broken branches showing the passage of large animals. It was during one of these return visits that he first noticed something odd. The tracks he found weren't just random bear movements, they seemed to form a pattern. The mother bear appeared to be circulating near his usual patrol routes, keeping just out of sight but definitely present. Jake's scientific mind told him this was impossible, that he was reading too much into normal wildlife behavior. but his instinct suggested otherwise. One morning, while checking the area around his station, Jake discovered fresh bear prints in the mud near his cabin. The tracks were distinctive. The slight drag mark from an injured hind leg left no doubt about their origin. The mother bear had been here, less than 100 yards from where he slept. Instead of feeling afraid, Jake felt a surge of curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name, a sense of being chosen for something he didn't yet understand. As Jake photographed the tracks and added them to his growing collection of observations, he began to notice other, more disturbing signs in the park. Tire marks appeared in restricted areas where no vehicles should have been. Small objects that looked suspiciously like motion sensors were found attached to trees. At first, he tried to dismiss these findings as the work of over-enthusiastic photographers or misguided tourists, but his gut told him something more sinister was at play. During his afternoon patrol, Jake discovered something that confirmed his worst fears. Hidden beneath some brush, he found a sophisticated tracking device, its metallic surface glinting in the sunlight. This was no amateur equipment. It was professional grade, the kind used in wildlife research or tracking. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone was monitoring the park's wildlife with technology that far exceeded what casual observers would have access to. That evening, as Jake sat on his cabin's small porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, he felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. The mother bear's trust, for he was now certain that's what she had shown him, seemed even more significant in light of his discoveries. She had somehow sensed in him a protector, not just of her cub, but perhaps of something larger. As darkness fell over Yellowstone, Jake made a decision. He would expand his patrols, document everything he found, and try to understand the connection between the mysterious trackers and the injured bear, who seemed to be watching over him as much as he was watching over her. Little did he know, this decision would lead him down a path that would test not only his skills as a ranger, but also his understanding of the delicate balance between wilderness and civilization. In the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing through the valleys. Jake smiled, remembering something his father had once told him: the wilderness always finds its guardians. Looking out into the gathering darkness, he wondered if perhaps the wilderness had chosen him for reasons he was only beginning to understand. The following days brought an unseasonable chill to Yellowstone, matching the growing unease in Jake's mind. His patrols had become more than routine checks. They were now careful investigations of an increasingly disturbing pattern. The tracking devices he had discovered were just the beginning. Each day seemed to reveal new signs of unauthorized activity in the park's most remote areas. During his morning patrol, Jake discovered something that made his stomach turn. Hidden beneath a carefully arranged pile of branches lay a large steel trap, its mechanical jaws rusty with what appeared to be dried blood. The sophistication of its design suggested this was no amateur operation. The trap's placement, near a well-worn animal trail, spoke of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Jake photographed the trap and carefully disabled it, his ranger training kicking in as he documented its location and characteristics. But his mind kept returning to the mother bear and her cub. The bear's injury suddenly made more sense. Had she encountered one of these traps before? The thought made his blood boil, but he forced himself to remain professional, methodically gathering evidence. As he worked, a drone's distinctive whine caught his attention. Looking up, Jake spotted the device hovering at the tree line, its camera clearly oriented in his direction. Before he could get a clear photo, the drone disappeared behind the canopy. Someone was watching him, and now they knew he had found their trap. The game had changed. He was no longer just observing suspicious activity. He had become part of the story. Back at his cabin that evening, Jake began mapping out all the locations where he had found evidence of intrusion. A pattern emerged. The unauthorized activities seemed to concentrate around specific wildlife corridors, particularly those used by the park's larger predators. This wasn't random, it was organized and purposeful. A soft scratching sound outside his cabin drew his attention. Jake approached the window cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, in the dirt near his porch, stood the mother bear. She was looking directly at his window, her presence both impossible to ignore and impossible to explain. The cub played near her feet, seemingly recovered from its near drowning. Jake stood transfixed, watching as the bear deliberately turned and walked toward the tree line, stopping to look back at him. The message seemed clear. She wanted him to follow. Every safety protocol in his training manual screamed against what he was about to do, but Jake had long since realized that this situation defied standard procedures. Grabbing his gear and flashlight, Jake followed the bears at a respectful distance. They led him through the darkness to a clearing he had never noticed before. There, hidden behind thick undergrowth, he found fresh tire tracks and what appeared to be recently discarded equipment, water bottles, energy bar wrappers, and most tellingly, a sophisticated radio transmitter that had been partially buried. The bears had led him to what appeared to be a staging area for whoever was conducting illegal activities in the park. Jake's mind raced with the implications. How had the mother bear known about this location? The connection between them seemed to deepen with each encounter, challenging everything he thought he knew about wildlife behavior. As he documented the new evidence, Jake heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. The bears had already disappeared into the forest, but their warning was clear. He quickly concealed himself in the underbrush, watching as two black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the clearing. The vehicle's headlights were off, and the men who emerged moved with practiced efficiency, unloading equipment in near total silence. Jake's heart pounded as he observed their operation. These weren't ordinary poachers. Their gear was military grade, and they moved with professional precision. He watched as they set up sophisticated surveillance equipment and consulted what appeared to be detailed topographical maps of the park. Through his binoculars, Jake could make out containers designed for transporting live animals. The size and construction of these containers sent a chill down his spine. They were clearly intended for large predators. The operation was far bigger than he had initially suspected, and he was now in far deeper than he had ever intended to be. As he carefully retreated from his hiding spot, Jake's mind was already formulating a plan. He needed help, but he also needed to be careful about how he proceeded. These people were professionals and they had resources. One wrong move could compromise not only his investigation, but also the safety of the animals he was sworn to protect. Back at his cabin, Jake began compiling all his evidence into a secure digital file. The mother bear's role in leading him to the staging area added a dimension to the story that he could hardly believe himself. How could he explain that a wild animal was actively helping him investigate a potential threat to the park? As dawn approached, Jake stood on his porch, watching the first light touch the mountains. The morning mist cast an ethereal quality over the landscape, but he could no longer see it with the same innocent wonder he had just weeks ago. Somewhere in those hills, people were planning something that threatened the delicate balance of this wilderness. And somewhere out there, a mother bear and her cub were counting on him to stop it. A hawk's cry pierced the morning silence, its sharp call seeming to underscore the gravity of Jake's situation. He was no longer just a rookie ranger finding his feet in a new job. He had become something more, a guardian chosen by the wilderness itself, entrusted with a mission that would require all his courage and cunning to complete. The early morning briefing at Ranger headquarters had a different energy than usual. Jake sat quietly, his field notebook filled with carefully documented observations, as he listened to other rangers report increased signs of unauthorized activity throughout the park. He wasn't the only one who had noticed something was wrong, but he might be the only one who understood the full scope of what they were facing. "Turner," Chief Ranger Sarah Martinez called out as the meeting ended. "Stay behind for a moment." Jake's colleagues filed out, leaving him alone with his supervisor. Martinez was a seasoned ranger with 2 decades of experience, and very little escaped her notice. "You've been spending a lot of time in the northern sector lately. Found something interesting?" Jake hesitated, weighing his words carefully. How could he explain what he had discovered without sounding completely unbelievable? He decided to start with the concrete evidence. "I found multiple unauthorized tracking devices and traps in my sector. Professional-grade equipment, Chief. And there's more. I've observed vehicles operating after hours, sophisticated surveillance setups." Martinez's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "Show me what you've got." Jake pulled out his tablet, displaying the photos and maps he'd compiled. As Martinez scrolled through the evidence, her frown deepened. "This is concerning, Turner. But I get the feeling you're not telling me everything. The memory of the mother bear leading him to the staging area flashed through Jake's mind. "Chief, there's something else, but it's complicated." Before he could continue, an urgent call came through on Martinez's radio. Another ranger had discovered a cache of electronic equipment hidden near one of the park's remote thermal features. "Whatever you're holding back, Turner, I need to know," Martinez said after responding to the call. "This situation is escalating, and I can't have any of my rangers keeping secrets that might compromise our investigation." Jake took a deep breath. "You're going to think I'm crazy, but there's a bear, a mother and her cub. They're helping me." He proceeded to tell her about the river rescue, the strange connection that had developed, and how the bear had led him to crucial evidence. To his surprise, Martinez didn't immediately dismiss his story. "Yellowstone has a way of surprising even the most experienced rangers," she said thoughtfully. "I've seen things in this park that defy explanation. But Turner, if what you're saying is true, it makes this situation even more critical. These people aren't just threatening our wildlife, they're targeting specific animals with a level of organization we've rarely seen." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of helicopter rotors. Through the office window, they watched as a sleek black helicopter passed low over the trees, heading toward the restricted area where Jake had observed the SUVs. "That's the third unofficial flight this week," Martinez noted grimly. "They're getting bolder." Jake spent the rest of the morning setting up wildlife cameras in strategic locations, hoping to catch evidence of the intruders' movements. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by the mother bear this time, but by something more sinister. The drone he had spotted earlier made another appearance, hovering just long enough to make its presence known, before disappearing into the clouds. In the afternoon, Jake discovered fresh bear tracks near one of his cameras. The mother bear's distinctive gait, marked by her injury, was easily recognizable. She had circled the camera 3 times, almost as if she was checking his work. Next to her tracks were clear impressions of her cub's smaller paws, and something else, fresh tire tracks that cut across the bear's trail. Following the vehicle tracks, Jake found himself in a narrow valley he had never explored before. The signs of human activity here were more obvious: branches broken by large vehicles, discarded equipment tags, and most disturbingly, a sophisticated communications array hidden under camouflage netting. As he documented the new evidence, a distant rumble of thunder warned of an approaching storm. The weather could work to his advantage, providing cover for a closer investigation of the communications equipment. But as Jake approached the array, his radio crackled with an urgent message from Martinez. "Turner, we've got movement in your sector. Multiple vehicles heading your way. Get out of there now." The warning came just in time. Through the trees, Jake could see the now familiar black SUVs approaching. He quickly retreated, using the increasing rain as cover. Finding shelter under a rocky overhang, Jake watched as a team of men in professional outdoor gear began adjusting the communications array. Their efficiency and equipment spoke of serious funding and organization. This was no simple poaching operation. They were setting up a long-term presence in the park. The storm intensified, but the men continued their work, seemingly undeterred by the weather. Lightning illuminated the valley in stark flashes, and in one of these moments, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the men was studying a map, marked with dozens of points, locations that corresponded exactly with known predator territories throughout the park. As darkness fell and the storm raged on, Jake made his way back to his cabin, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. The operation was larger and more organized than anyone had suspected, and it was clear they were specifically targeting the park's predator populations. In his cabin, Jake began updating his digital evidence file, adding the day's discoveries. A flash of lightning illuminated his window, and for a brief moment, he saw a familiar silhouette in the rain, the mother bear, standing guard like a sentinel in the storm. She was still watching, still protecting, still trusting him to uncover the truth about the threats to her home. The following morning broke with an eerie calm after the storm, but Jake could feel the tension in the air like static before lightning. His evidence file had grown substantially, painting a picture of a sophisticated operation that seemed to be closing in on the park's wildlife. The mother bear's warnings had proven invaluable, but they had also drawn him deeper into a situation that grew more dangerous by the day. As Jake prepared for his morning patrol, his satellite phone buzzed with a message from Chief Martinez. Weather system moving in, major storm predicted. All non-essential personnel evacuated, maintain radio contact. The message was standard procedure, but something in Martinez's tone suggested there was more to it than weather concerns. The clouds gathering on the horizon were dark and heavy, promising the kind of storm that could shut down park operations for days. Perfect weather for anyone wanting to conduct activities away from prying eyes. Jake checked his equipment with extra care, making sure his cameras were weatherproofed and his tracking devices were fully charged. Near the location where he had found the communications array, Jake discovered fresh evidence of activity. New tire tracks, despite the park being closed to visitors. More concerning were the sophisticated motion sensors now dotted along the wildlife trails. These weren't just tracking devices anymore, they were creating a virtual fence around specific areas of the park. A familiar sound caught his attention, the soft huffing of a bear. The mother bear emerged from the trees, her cub close behind. Their appearances were becoming more deliberate, almost strategic. She approached closer than ever before, her eyes conveying an urgency that Jake had learned to read. When she moved off into the underbrush, he followed without hesitation. The bear led him to a hidden valley, where Jake discovered something that made his previous findings seem minor. A temporary base camp had been established, carefully concealed from aerial observation. Through his binoculars, he could see storage containers, satellite equipment, and most disturbingly, a series of large transport cages. As Jake documented the camp, the mother bear's behavior became increasingly agitated. She paced back and forth, her cub mimicking her movements. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the first drops of rain from the approaching storm. But there was something else, the distant sound of engines growing closer. Jake quickly retreated to a concealed position as 3 vehicles entered the valley. Men in professional outdoor gear emerged, their movements practiced and efficient. They began preparing the camp for the incoming storm, but their activities suggested they were also preparing for something else, something big. Through his zoom lens, Jake captured images of their equipment and activities. One of the men was consulting a tablet that displayed what appeared to be thermal imaging data. Another was adjusting what looked like tranquilizer rifles, professional-grade wildlife capture equipment. The operation was moving into a new phase. The storm hit with full force, but the men continued their preparations. Lightning illuminated the valley in strobic flashes, revealing glimpses of their operation. They were setting up a perimeter of sophisticated traps and sensors, creating a web that would alert them to any large animal movement in the area. Jake's position was becoming precarious as the storm intensified. The mother bear and her cub had vanished into the forest, but not before leaving him with clear tracks leading away from the valley. As he followed their trail, he realized they were leading him to higher ground, away from potential flood zones and toward a vantage point overlooking the entire operation. From his new position, Jake could see the full scope of what he was dealing with. The camp was just one part of a larger network. Through breaks in the rain, he spotted similar setups in adjacent valleys, all connected by hidden access roads. This wasn't just a campaign to capture a few animals, it was a coordinated effort to systematically target the park's predator populations. Using his satellite phone's camera, Jake documented everything he could see. The storm provided cover for his surveillance, but it also meant he was isolated. Regular radio communications were disrupted by the weather, and the park's evacuation meant backup was hours away at best. As darkness approached, the wind rose to a howl and the rain became a solid wall of water. Jake made his way carefully back toward his cabin, but something made him pause. Through the sheets of rain, he caught glimpses of movement. The men from the camp were mobilizing despite the storm, their vehicles moving out in a coordinated pattern. The mother bear appeared suddenly beside him, her presence a warning. She was agitated, more than he had ever seen her. The cub stayed close to her side, equally alert. Their behavior confirmed Jake's suspicions. The storm wasn't hampering the operation, it was providing cover for it. In the growing darkness, illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning, Jake could see more vehicles arriving. The storm had given them the opportunity they had been waiting for. But it had also given him something, a chance to gather evidence that could expose their entire operation. As he watched from his hidden position, Jake knew he was witnessing the beginning of their endgame. The question was, could he stop them before they succeeded in whatever they had planned? Lightning split the sky as Jake carefully maneuvered through the rain-soaked forest. The storm had transformed Yellowstone's familiar terrain into a treacherous maze of mud and swollen streams. But it wasn't just the weather that made his heart race. The illegal operation was clearly entering its final phase, and he was the only ranger in position to document it. Through his night vision binoculars, Jake observed the increased activity at the hidden camp. The professional team had deployed additional equipment, including what appeared to be mobile tracking stations. Their movements suggested urgency, as if they were working against more than just the weather. Each flash of lightning revealed more details of their operation, cages being positioned, teams spreading out in strategic formations. The mother bear and her cub had disappeared into the darkness, but Jake could sense they were nearby, watching. Over the past weeks, their appearances had become more than just coincidence. They were actively participating in his investigation, warning him of danger and leading him to crucial evidence. Now, as the operation reached its climax, their presence felt more significant than ever. Using the storm's cover, Jake managed to get closer to the camp's perimeter. The rain hammered against his weather-resistant gear as he documented everything he could. The team had set up a sophisticated grid of sensors and traps, creating a virtual net that would funnel any large predators into predetermined capture zones. Their level of preparation was staggering. A sudden movement caught his eye. Through the curtain of rain, he spotted several team members deploying what looked like automated drones, weather-resistant models designed to maintain surveillance even in these conditions. Jake pressed himself against a tree, conscious that his own technology might not be the only eyes watching the forest tonight. The wind carried fragments of conversation to his position. Grid sectors Alpha through Delta are active. Weather system providing optimal coverage. Primary targets confirmed in sectors 2 and 5. The professional tone of their communications only emphasized the operation's sophistication. These weren't opportunistic poachers. This was a carefully planned extraction operation. Jake's satellite phone vibrated. A message from Chief Martinez had somehow made it through the storm. "Turner, if you're receiving this, we've lost contact with all remote stations. Storm's worse than predicted. Stay sheltered. Backup can't reach you until weather clears." The message confirmed what Jake had suspected. He was on his own. A series of high-pitched beeps cut through the storm's roar. The team's sensor grid had detected something. Through his binoculars, Jake watched as they mobilized with military precision, moving toward one of the predetermined capture zones. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. Their operation was designed to take advantage of exactly these weather conditions, when the animals would be most vulnerable. Using his ranger training, Jake began paralleling their movement, staying just outside their sensor grid. The rain provided excellent cover, masking both sound and scent. He needed to document whatever was about to happen, but he also needed to maintain his position without being detected. One wrong move could compromise weeks of investigation. The team's lights suddenly converged on a point ahead. Jake's breath caught in his throat. In the illuminated circle stood the mother bear and her cub, but something was different about their behavior. Instead of trying to escape, they seemed to be deliberately drawing attention. The mother bear's movements were too purposeful, too calculated. As Jake watched, the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. The bears weren't victims of the trap. They were helping to expose it. The mother bear was deliberately triggering the sensors, revealing the team's positions and tactics. Her actions were allowing Jake to document the entire operation in action. The storm intensified, but the team remained focused on the bears. They didn't realize they were being led into revealing their entire methodology. Jake's camera worked steadily, capturing every detail: the specialized equipment, the coordinated movements, the professional-grade capture gear. Every lightning flash provided another piece of evidence. Suddenly, the mother bear changed direction, moving with surprising speed despite her injury. The cub followed perfectly, and the entire team was forced to adjust their position. In their haste to keep up with the bears, they left their support equipment exposed. Jake seized the opportunity, photographing their advanced tracking systems and documentation. The wind shifted, driving the rain horizontally and carrying with it a new sound: the distant rumble of vehicles. Through breaks in the storm, Jake could see more trucks arriving. The operation was escalating, but so was the weather. The storm that had provided their cover was becoming a threat to their plans. As Jake documented this new development, he realized the mother bear had orchestrated something remarkable. She had not only helped expose the operation, but had done so in a way that protected both herself and her cub while providing him with the evidence he needed. The connection between them had evolved into something unprecedented, a partnership between human and wildlife that defied explanation. The night was far from over, and the storm showed no signs of abating. But as Jake watched the operation unfold before him, he knew he was witnessing something historic. The question now was how to use what he had discovered to stop them before they could complete their mission. The mother bear had done her part. Now it was up to him to find a way to protect not just her and her cub, but all the wildlife these people were targeting. The storm reached a fever pitch as Jake carefully made his way through the darkness, his mind racing with possibilities. The evidence he had gathered was substantial, but he knew the operation wouldn't wait for the authorities to arrive. He needed to act, and quickly, while maintaining his cover and ensuring the safety of the park's wildlife. The mother bear's strategic revelations had given him an unprecedented advantage. Through her actions, he now understood the team's methodology, their equipment placement, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. The sophisticated sensor grid they had established was impressive, but it had one critical weakness. It was designed to track large animals, not humans who knew exactly where the sensors were placed. Using his ranger training and the knowledge gained from weeks of observation, Jake began a careful counter-operation. He moved between the sensor zones, using the storm as cover. The rain had turned the ground treacherous, but it also masked his movements from the thermal imaging equipment he had seen them using. Through his night vision equipment, he observed the team's growing frustration. The mother bear's clever maneuvering had forced them to spread their resources thin, creating gaps in their coverage. Jake took advantage of these gaps, methodically documenting their entire operation from multiple angles. Every flash of lightning revealed another crucial piece of evidence. The team's radio communications, partially audible through the storm, indicated mounting pressure from their superiors. Time window closing. Weather system intensifying. Primary target still not secured. Their professional demeanor was beginning to crack, revealing the stress of a plan unraveling. Jake's satellite phone buzzed again. Another message from Chief Martinez had made it through. Turner weather station reporting storm intensification. All access roads compromised. Whatever you're doing, be careful. You're still on your own until morning. The message only confirmed what he already knew. He had to handle this situation himself. The mother bear appeared briefly on a ridge above the operation, her silhouette illuminated by lightning. Her cub stayed close as she surveyed the scene below. Their presence seemed to energize the team, who immediately began repositioning their equipment. But Jake could see what they couldn't. The bears were leading them away from their supply lines, forcing them to abandon crucial gear in their haste to follow. Using this distraction, Jake managed to get close enough to their command center to overhear more detailed plans. The operation had a strict timeline, and the storm was threatening to derail it. They needed to secure their targets before the weather made extraction impossible. Their frustration was making them careless, creating opportunities Jake could exploit. As he documented their hasty repositioning, Jake noticed something crucial. In their rush to follow the bears, they had left their communications array vulnerable. The sophisticated equipment that coordinated their entire operation was now exposed to the elements, protected only by hastily erected weather shields. The mother bear's strategy became clear to Jake. She wasn't just exposing their operation, she was systematically forcing them to make mistakes. Each time they moved their equipment in pursuit, they left it more vulnerable to the intensifying storm. The weather that had initially provided their cover was becoming their greatest threat. Jake carefully made his way to the exposed communications array. His ranger training included basic knowledge of such systems, and he could see that the equipment was already struggling with the weather. The team had been forced to choose between maintaining their technical infrastructure and pursuing their targets, and the bears had made that choice for them. Lightning struck a nearby tree with a deafening crack, temporarily illuminating the entire valley. In that brief, brilliant moment, Jake saw the full scope of what was happening. The team's carefully planned operation was disintegrating in the face of nature itself. The storm, the bears, and his own careful documentation were combining to create a perfect storm of their own, one that threatened to expose and disrupt the entire illegal enterprise. Through his binoculars, Jake watched as the mother bear led the team on another futile chase, drawing them further from their support equipment. Her injury seemed to have vanished as she moved with surprising agility through the storm, her cub matching her movements perfectly. They were more than just survivors now. They were active participants in protecting their home. As the night wore on, the storm's intensity continued to build. The team's sophisticated equipment, designed for precision and control, was proving increasingly ineffective against the raw power of nature. Their frustrated communications revealed an operation falling apart, their carefully laid plans unraveling in the face of unexpected resistance from both the weather and the wildlife they sought to capture. Jake realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a convergence of human determination, animal intelligence, and natural forces creating a turning point in the battle for Yellowstone's wildlife. The mother bear's trust in him had led to this moment, and now it was up to him to ensure their partnership would protect not just her and her cub, but all the creatures these people were targeting. The pre-dawn hours brought no relief from the storm's fury. If anything, the weather had intensified, turning Yellowstone into a landscape of shadows and sudden lightning flashes. Jake had spent the night documenting the illegal operation's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage their plans, but now he needed to move beyond observation to action. His satellite phone contained enough evidence to convince even the most skeptical authorities. Dozens of high-resolution photos and videos showing the team's equipment, their methodologies, and their increasingly frantic attempts to capture the park's wildlife. The mother bear's clever manipulation of their operations had forced them to reveal far more than they'd intended. Through his binoculars, Jake watched as the team struggled to maintain their equipment in the face of the storm. Their sophisticated sensors, already compromised by the weather, were showing signs of complete failure. The professional composure they'd displayed earlier had cracked, revealing the frustration of men watching a carefully planned operation dissolve in the rain. The mother bear and her cub had temporarily vanished into the forest, but their impact remained. The team's pursuit had left their equipment scattered across multiple locations, exposed to the elements and increasingly difficult to maintain. Their radio communications, still partially audible through the storm, revealed growing tension between field operators and their unseen superiors. Jake used this chaos to his advantage, carefully moving between their abandoned positions and gathering more detailed evidence. Each site told part of the story: specialized transport cages designed for large predators, documents partially protected from the rain, equipment logs that revealed the operation's true scope. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture that would be impossible to ignore. A sudden burst of activity caught his attention. The team was hastily breaking down their remaining equipment, loading it into their vehicles with none of their earlier precision. Through the rain, Jake could hear urgent conversations. Primary extraction route compromised. Alternative access points flooded, command demanding immediate withdrawal. The storm had done what Jake alone could not. It had forced them to abandon their mission. But as he watched their hasty departure preparations, he realized this might be his best opportunity to gather conclusive evidence. In their rush to evacuate, they were leaving behind documents and equipment that could prove crucial in preventing future attempts. Using his ranger training, Jake carefully approached their main camp. The team's attention was focused on saving their most expensive equipment, creating an opportunity to access their hastily abandoned documentation. Each flash of lightning required him to freeze in place, using the darkness between flashes to move closer. The mother bear chose this moment to make her final appearance. She emerged from the forest at a point exactly opposite from Jake's position, her cub close behind. The team's remaining sensors immediately detected her presence, drawing all attention in her direction. It was the distraction Jake needed. Moving quickly but carefully through the rain, Jake reached the command tent they had left partially standing. Inside, protected from the worst of the storm, he found what he'd been hoping for: detailed maps showing planned operation sites across multiple national parks, equipment manifests, and most importantly, communications logs that revealed the operation's full scope. As Jake documented these findings, a sudden change in the storm's pattern sent the team into full retreat. The weather station warnings had been accurate. The storm was about to get much worse. Their vehicles began pulling out in a hurry, abandoning equipment they couldn't quickly pack. The operation that had threatened Yellowstone's wildlife was quite literally being washed away. The mother bear watched from the tree line as the last vehicles disappeared into the rain. Her presence throughout the night had been more than just a coincidence. She had helped orchestrate the operation's failure, working in concert with the storm and Jake's careful documentation to protect her home. As the first hints of dawn tried to break through the storm clouds, Jake began the careful process of securing the evidence. The operation had failed, but the documentation he had gathered would help prevent future attempts. The mother bear and her cub made one final appearance, standing at the edge of the clearing, as if surveying the results of their night's work. Jake watched as they melted back into the forest, knowing that their partnership had accomplished something remarkable. Together, they had protected not just themselves, but all of Yellowstone's wildlife from those who would exploit it. The storm was beginning to ease, and soon backup would arrive, but the real work had already been done by a dedicated ranger, a clever bear, and the raw power of nature itself. The evidence was secure, the operation was in ruins, and as Jake began the trek back to his cabin, he realized that his understanding of the relationship between humans and wildlife had been forever changed. The mother bear had shown him that protection of the wilderness required more than just human intervention. It needed partnership with the very creatures they were trying to protect. The morning after the storm broke over Yellowstone with an almost ethereal calm. Sunlight pierced through dissipating clouds, illuminating a landscape transformed by the night's events. Jake stood with Chief Martinez and a team of senior rangers, surveying the evidence left behind by the hasty evacuation of the illegal operation. "I've been a ranger for 20 years, Martinez said, examining the sophisticated equipment abandoned in the mud, "and I've never seen anything like this." The scale of what they were planning. She shook her head, reviewing the documentation Jake had gathered during the storm. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed plans, equipment logs, and surveillance data that revealed an operation designed to capture and transport large predators from multiple national parks. The ranger team worked methodically, photographing and cataloging every piece of evidence. The storm had done considerable damage to the abandoned equipment, but enough remained to paint a clear picture of the operation's intentions. The transport cages, tracking devices, and technical documentation told a story that would have serious implications for wildlife protection across all national parks. Jake led them through the various sites where the mother bear had helped expose the operation. Though he carefully avoided mentioning the bear's deliberate assistance, he couldn't help but notice fresh tracks in the mud. She was still watching, still participating in her own way. Her presence throughout the investigation had been more than just coincidence, and the evidence they were gathering would help protect not just her and her cub, but all of Yellowstone's wildlife. "The storm was a blessing in disguise," one of the senior rangers commented, examining the sophisticated sensor grid that had been abandoned. Their own equipment turned against them when the weather hit, but something else was working against them too. These tracks show unusual movement patterns for a bear, almost like it was deliberately interfering with their operation. Jake remained silent, remembering how the mother bear had systematically led the team away from their equipment, forcing them to expose their methods and ultimately abandon their plans. Some things, he realized, were better left unexplained. The connection he had developed with the bears was something that defied conventional understanding. As the morning progressed, more ranger teams arrived, along with federal investigators who had been monitoring similar incidents in other parks. Jake's evidence provided the missing link they needed, connecting isolated reports into a pattern that revealed a coordinated threat to protected wildlife across the country. "Turner," Martinez called him aside as the investigation teams worked. "Your documentation of this operation is remarkable, but I get the feeling there's more to the story than what's in your reports." She looked at him knowingly, then gestured toward fresh bear tracks leading away from the scene. "Sometimes nature chooses its own guardians. You've proven yourself worthy of that trust." The implications of her words struck Jake deeply. She understood, perhaps better than he had realized, that something extraordinary had happened during his investigation. The partnership between a ranger and a wild bear might seem impossible, but the evidence of their combined efforts was scattered across the valley. Throughout the day, Jake helped the investigation teams piece together the operation's methodology. The sophisticated equipment they had abandoned revealed a level of organization that alarmed even the most experienced rangers. But it also showed how vulnerable such technical operations were to the combined forces of nature and wildlife working in harmony with those dedicated to protecting them. As the sun began to set, Jake took a moment to walk alone to the river where his journey had begun, where he had first rescued the bear cub. The mother bear and her offspring appeared briefly on the opposite bank, their presence a reminder of the extraordinary partnership that had developed. They looked healthy and strong, showing no signs of the ordeals they had faced. The bears watched him for a moment, their connection as strong as ever. Then, with a gentle motion that seemed almost like a nod, the mother bear led her cub into the forest. They had accomplished what needed to be done, working together to protect their shared home. Now it was time for them to return to their natural roles, the bears as wild creatures of Yellowstone and Jake as their dedicated protector. The investigation would continue for months, with Jake's evidence playing a crucial role in dismantling similar operations across the country. But as he watched the bears disappear into their wilderness home, he knew that the most important outcome couldn't be measured in arrests or confiscated equipment. It was the deeper understanding of how humans and wildlife could work together to protect the natural world they shared. Rangers passing through the area in the following days would report seeing the mother bear and her cub, thriving in their protected environment. They had no way of knowing the role these bears had played in preserving their home, but Jake understood. Some partnerships transcend the ordinary boundaries between humans and wildlife, creating bonds that serve a higher purpose in protecting the wilderness. The weeks following the storm brought significant changes to Yellowstone. News of the thwarted operation had reached the highest levels of park administration, leading to enhanced security measures and increased funding for wildlife protection. Jake found himself at the center of these changes, his detailed documentation becoming the foundation for new protective protocols across the national park system. "Your work has opened our eyes to vulnerabilities we never knew existed," the park superintendent told Jake during a briefing session. The evidence he had gathered revealed sophisticated methods that threatened not just Yellowstone's wildlife, but protected animals in parks across the country. His observations and quick thinking during the storm had provided crucial insights into preventing future attempts. The investigation teams had been particularly impressed by the comprehensive nature of Jake's documentation. His photographs and notes showed not just what the operation was doing, but how they were doing it, crucial information for protecting other parks. The sophisticated equipment they had abandoned in their hasty retreat provided additional insights into their methods and capabilities. Jake maintained his regular patrols, but his role had evolved. Senior rangers now sought his input on wildlife protection strategies, and his observations about animal behavior were given special attention. The connection he had developed with the mother bear and her cub had given him unique insights into how wildlife responded to human activities, both beneficial and threatening. During one of his morning patrols, Jake encountered the mother bear and her cub near the river where their story had begun. The bears looked strong and healthy, their movements showing no sign of past traumas. The mother's injury had healed well, and her cub had grown noticeably. They acknowledged his presence with familiar ease before continuing their natural foraging activities. The sight filled Jake with quiet satisfaction. This was how it should be, the bears living freely in their natural habitat, with humans serving as guardians rather than threats. The partnership they had formed during the investigation had served its purpose, and now they could return to their respective roles in the natural order of the park. Chief Martinez had incorporated many of Jake's observations into the park's new security protocols. "What you've shown us about wildlife behavior patterns has changed how we approach protection," she explained during a staff meeting. "We're not just guarding against human threats anymore. We're learning to work with the natural intelligence of the animals themselves." The abandoned equipment had been carefully analyzed, revealing connections to similar operations around the world. Jake's documentation provided crucial evidence for international investigations into wildlife trafficking and illegal animal capture operations. The sophisticated nature of the equipment confirmed the global scale of the threat to protected wildlife. As summer progressed, Jake noticed subtle changes in how the park's animals interacted with ranger patrols. There seemed to be a greater awareness, a more nuanced cooperation between wildlife and those tasked with protecting them. The mother bear had shown that animals could recognize and respond to human allies, and this understanding was reshaping ranger protocols. During one patrol, Jake found fresh bear tracks near a newly installed security camera. The prints showed the mother bear had investigated the equipment, but left it untouched, as if she recognized it as part of the park's protection system. Her understanding of human technology and intentions continued to amaze him. The cub, growing stronger each day, had learned from its mother's example. Jake often observed them working together to avoid tourist areas while remaining visible enough to ranger patrols to maintain their safety. Their behavior demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human activities in the park. News of the operation's discovery had led to increased public interest in wildlife protection. Visitor centers now included educational displays about the importance of preserving natural habitats and protecting endangered species. Jake's experiences, carefully anonymized, became part of the park's training materials for new rangers. As autumn approached, bringing the first hints of color to Yellowstone's forests, Jake reflected on how much had changed since his first day as a rookie ranger. The simple act of saving a bear cub had evolved into something far more significant, a partnership that had helped protect the entire park and influenced wildlife conservation practices across the country. The mother bear and her cub still appeared occasionally during his patrols, their presence a reminder of the extraordinary events they had shared. But now their interactions were those of mutual respect between wild creatures and a guardian of their domain. They had shown him that true wildlife protection required more than just human intervention. It needed understanding, respect, and sometimes unexpected partnerships. Fall painted Yellowstone in vibrant colors as the park settled into its new normal. Jake's rounds had taken on added significance since the events of the summer storm. His experience had not only transformed him, but had begun to influence how rangers across the country approached wildlife protection. The partnership he had formed with the mother bear and her cub had become something of a legend among the ranger community, though few knew the full story. The evidence gathered during the storm had led to the implementation of sophisticated new protection measures throughout the park system. Motion sensors, carefully placed cameras, and regular patrols now formed an intricate web of security, designed to protect rather than capture. Jake took pride in knowing that his documentation had helped shape these changes. During a crisp morning patrol, Jake encountered signs that the mother bear and her cub had been monitoring one of the new security installations. Their tracks showed a deliberate pattern of movement around the equipment, almost as if they were performing their own inspection. The cub's prints, now nearly as large as its mother's, demonstrated how much time had passed since their first encounter. "The bears seem to understand what we're doing," remarked Sarah Martinez during a field review. "It's as if they're actively participating in their own protection." She didn't know how right she was. Jake had witnessed firsthand how the mother bear's intelligence and awareness had helped expose the illegal operation, and now she continued to demonstrate an extraordinary understanding of human efforts to protect the park. The partnership between rangers and wildlife had evolved in unexpected ways. Other rangers began reporting similar instances of animals appearing to cooperate with protection efforts. Wolves would appear at strategic times during patrols. Elk herds would adjust their movements to avoid areas where suspicious activity had been noted, and even the smaller creatures seemed more attuned to the ranger's protective presence. Jake's documentation methods had become standard practice across the Park Service. His detailed observations of wildlife behavior patterns, combined with technical monitoring, created a more comprehensive approach to conservation. Rangers were now trained to look for signs of animal intelligence and cooperation, understanding that the wildlife they protected could be their greatest allies. One afternoon, while checking a remote camera installation, Jake found evidence that the mother bear had led her cub through a training routine of sorts. Their tracks showed how she had demonstrated safe paths around human installations, teaching her offspring the complex balance between utilizing ranger protection and maintaining wild instincts. The cub's tracks showed it had followed perfectly, learning lessons that would ensure its survival. The scientific community had taken notice of the changes in Yellowstone. Researchers visited the park to study the new relationship between rangers and wildlife, though none could fully explain the level of cooperation they observed. Jake knew that some things couldn't be captured in scientific papers: the trust between a ranger and a mother bear, the understanding that had developed through shared purpose. As Jake reviewed the security footage one evening, he noticed something remarkable. The mother bear and her cub had developed a regular pattern of checking the park's new security installations. They would appear briefly on camera, inspect the equipment from a safe distance, and then disappear back into the wilderness. Their behavior suggested an ongoing commitment to the partnership that had begun with a river rescue. The park's new protection systems incorporated many of the lessons learned during the summer's events. Regular patrols were now coordinated with wildlife movement patterns, and security equipment was placed with consideration for natural behaviors. The mother bear's influence could be seen in many of these changes, though few understood the full extent of her contribution. Throughout the fall, Jake continued to encounter signs of the bear's presence during his patrols. They maintained their distance now as proper wild creatures should, but their awareness of his activities was clear. The cub had grown into a strong young bear, carrying forward its mother's legacy of intelligence and adaptation. The partnership had evolved into something sustainable, a model for how humans and wildlife could work together to protect their shared environment. Other parks began adopting Yellowstone's new approach, creating a network of protection that respected and utilized the natural intelligence of wildlife. During one of his last patrols of the season, Jake found fresh tracks in the first snow. The mother bear and her cub had visited the river where their story began. Their prints told a story of confidence and strength, of wild creatures thriving in a protected environment. They had shown him that true conservation required more than just human oversight. It needed the active participation of the very creatures being protected. The success of the new protection measures proved that the lessons learned during the summer storm had far-reaching implications. The partnership between a ranger and a bear had helped create a new model of conservation, one that recognized and respected the intelligence and agency of wildlife. As winter approached, Jake knew that their story would continue to influence the future of wildlife protection, though the full extent of their impact was still unfolding. Winter's approach brought new challenges to Yellowstone, with blankets of snow transforming the landscape into a pristine wilderness. For Jake, each patrol now carried memories of the extraordinary events that had reshaped his understanding of wildlife protection. The mother bear and her cub would soon begin their winter rest, but their influence on the park's operations continued to grow. The success of Yellowstone's new protection protocols had attracted attention from conservation experts worldwide. Jake found himself consulting with rangers from other national parks, sharing the insights gained from his unique experience. While he carefully avoided mentioning the full extent of his partnership with the bears, their story had become a catalyst for change in wildlife protection strategies. During a morning briefing, Chief Martinez shared reports from other parks that had adopted Yellowstone's new approach. "We're seeing unprecedented levels of cooperation between rangers and wildlife," she explained. "It's as if the animals recognize that we're working to protect them." Jake smiled, knowing that the mother bear had been the first to demonstrate this possibility. The park's educational programs had been updated to include information about animal intelligence and behavior. Visitors learned about the sophisticated ways wildlife adapted to human presence and how rangers worked to protect these natural behaviors. The mother bear and her cub, though unnamed in these programs, had become symbols of successful conservation efforts. Jake's regular patrols now included checking the network of protection systems that had been implemented since the summer. Each installation showed signs of wildlife interaction, tracks in the snow, marking patterns and behavioral changes that suggested the animals were actively engaging with the protection measures. The mother bear's example had inspired a new level of cooperation between wildlife and rangers. During one cold morning patrol, Jake discovered fresh tracks leading to one of the new monitoring stations. The mother bear had made one final inspection before winter, her cub's prints showing confidence and strength. Their behavior demonstrated how wild animals could maintain their natural instincts while adapting to beneficial human presence. The scientific community had begun studying what they called the Yellowstone model of wildlife protection. Researchers were particularly interested in how animals seemed to distinguish between protective human activities and potential threats. Jake knew that this understanding had started with one bear's decision to trust a ranger who had saved her cub. As winter settled over the park, Jake reviewed the season's documentation. The security footage showed a clear pattern of wildlife adaptation to the new protection measures. Animals would alert rangers to unusual activities, adjust their movements to avoid potential threats, and demonstrate an understanding of the park's security systems that amazed even experienced observers. The mother bear's influence extended beyond her own species. Other animals had begun showing similar awareness of ranger activities, creating a network of natural surveillance that complemented the park's technical security measures. Wolves would patrol alongside ranger routes, elk herds would signal potential threats, and even smaller creatures participated in their own way. One evening, while updating the park's protection protocols, Jake found himself reflecting on how much had changed since his first day as a ranger. The simple act of saving a bear cub had evolved into a revolutionary approach to wildlife conservation. The partnership he had formed with the mother bear had shown that true protection required trust and cooperation from both humans and animals. The winter season would give the bears their needed rest, but their legacy continued to shape the park's operations. Each new ranger learned about the importance of understanding and respecting wildlife behavior, though few knew the full story of how this approach had developed. The mother bear and her cub had become silent teachers, their example inspiring a new generation of conservation practices. Jake's experience had proven that wildlife protection was about more than just enforcing rules and maintaining boundaries. It required building trust, understanding natural behaviors, and recognizing that animals could be active participants in their own protection. The success of this approach was evident in the thriving wildlife populations and the increasing effectiveness of the park's protection measures. As the last leaves fell and the first heavy snows blanketed Yellowstone, Jake made one final patrol of the season. Near the river where his journey had begun, he found fresh tracks in the snow. The mother bear and her cub had passed through recently, checking the area one last time before their winter rest. Their prints told a story of strength, intelligence, and successful adaptation to the protected environment they had helped create. The coming spring would bring new challenges and opportunities, but the foundation had been laid for a sustainable partnership between rangers and wildlife. The mother bear's trust in Jake had sparked a transformation in conservation practices that would continue to evolve and grow, protecting wild creatures for generations to come. Spring returned to Yellowstone with its usual flourish of new life and renewed energy. For Jake, this season held special significance. It marked 1 year since his fateful encounter with the bear cub in the river. The changes that had stemmed from that moment continued to ripple through the Park Service, transforming how rangers approach their sacred duty of protecting wildlife. The morning sun painted the mountains in soft gold as Jake prepared for his patrol. The park had implemented the final phase of its new protection system, combining advanced technology with the natural intelligence of its wild inhabitants. The success of this approach had exceeded all expectations, creating a model that other conservation areas were eager to adopt. During his morning briefing, Chief Martinez shared some remarkable statistics. Wildlife incidents are down 60% since implementing the new protocols, she reported. But more importantly, we're seeing unprecedented levels of natural behavior in protected species. The animals, feeling secure in their environment, were displaying behaviors that hadn't been observed in decades. Jake's path took him past the river where his journey had begun. Fresh tracks in the morning dew revealed that the mother bear and her cub had emerged from their winter rest. Their prints showed strength and vitality, telling the story of successful adaptation to the protected environment they had helped create. The cub, now nearly grown, moved with the confidence of a young adult bear. The park's new training program for rangers had incorporated many lessons from Jake's experience. New recruits learned to recognize signs of wildlife intelligence and cooperation, understanding that the animals they protected could become their greatest allies in conservation efforts. The mother bear's story, though told without specific details, had become a cornerstone of this training. As Jake checked one of the new monitoring stations, he noticed subtle signs of animal interaction. The bears had already inspected the equipment, their tracks showing the same careful attention they had demonstrated during the previous summer's events. Other animals had followed their example, creating a network of natural surveillance that complemented the park's technical security measures. The scientific community had begun documenting what they called cooperative conservation, the phenomenon of wildlife actively participating in protection efforts. Researchers were particularly interested in how animals passed this behavior to their offspring, creating generations of wildlife that understood and utilized human protection while maintaining their wild nature. Near midday, Jake encountered the mother bear and her cub near a new security installation. They acknowledged his presence with familiar ease before continuing their inspection of the equipment. The cub, following its mother's example, demonstrated the same remarkable understanding of human technology that had helped expose the illegal operation the previous year. The park's educational programs now included information about animal intelligence and adaptation. Visitors learned how wildlife could distinguish between protective human activities and potential threats, though few understood the full story of how this knowledge had been gained. The mother bear and her cub had become unwitting teachers, their legacy shaping how humans understood their relationship with wild creatures. Jake's documentation methods had become standard practice throughout the national park system. Rangers were trained to observe and record not just animal movements, but also signs of intelligence and cooperation. The success of this approach was evident in the growing effectiveness of wildlife protection efforts across the country. During an afternoon patrol, Jake discovered fresh evidence of the bear's continuing influence. Other animals had begun following their patrol routes, creating a natural early warning system for unusual activities. Wolves would alert rangers to potential threats, elk herds would adjust their movements to avoid danger, and even smaller creatures participated in their own way. The partnership between rangers and wildlife had evolved into something sustainable and profound. Animals maintained their wild nature while benefiting from human protection, creating a balance that served both species. The mother bear's trust in Jake had sparked a transformation in conservation practices that continued to grow and adapt. As the day drew to a close, Jake found himself at the lookout point where he had documented the illegal operation during the storm. The view remained breathtaking, but now it held new meaning. The landscape before him wasn't just wilderness to be protected. It was a living system where humans and animals worked together to preserve the natural world. The mother bear and her cub appeared briefly on a distant ridge, their silhouettes strong against the setting sun. They had shown him that true conservation required more than just human oversight. It needed the active participation of the very creatures being protected. Their partnership had created a legacy that would continue to shape wildlife protection for generations to come. As summer returned to Yellowstone, the park had fundamentally transformed. The innovative protection systems, inspired by Jake's extraordinary experience with the mother bear and her cub, had created a new paradigm in wildlife conservation. Rangers and animals now worked in unprecedented harmony to preserve the delicate balance of nature. The morning mist still clung to the valleys as Jake began his patrol, his thoughts drifting to the events that had started this journey. The river where he had rescued the bear cub now symbolized more than just a moment of courage. It represented the beginning of a revolutionary approach to wildlife protection that had spread far beyond Yellowstone's boundaries. During the morning briefing, Chief Martinez shared news that brought their journey full circle. "The Department of Interior has officially adopted the Yellowstone Protocol," she announced. "Our methods will become the standard for wildlife protection across all national parks." Jake felt a quiet pride, knowing that the trust of one mother bear had helped reshape conservation practices nationwide. The mother bear and her cub, now almost fully grown, had become unofficial ambassadors of this new approach. Their continued interaction with the park's protection systems demonstrated how wildlife could maintain their wild nature while benefiting from human guardianship. The other animals had followed their example, creating a complex network of cooperation between species. Near midday, Jake encountered them near one of the new monitoring stations. The cub, nearly as large as its mother, moved with the confidence of an adult bear while maintaining the careful awareness its mother had taught. They acknowledged Jake's presence with familiar dignity before continuing their patrol of their territory. The success of Yellowstone's program had attracted international attention. Conservation experts from around the world visited the park to study how animals could actively participate in their own protection while remaining truly wild. The mother bear's legacy had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined that stormy night a year ago. Jake's afternoon patrol took him to the valley where they had exposed the illegal operation. The sophisticated security systems now in place bore little resemblance to the threatening equipment they had discovered that night. Instead, the technology worked in harmony with natural behaviors, creating a protective environment that respected wildlife intelligence. The park's database had accumulated a wealth of evidence showing how animals adapted to and utilized the protection systems. Wolves would alert rangers to unusual activities, bears would inspect security installations, and even smaller creatures played their parts in maintaining the park's security. The mother bear's example had inspired a level of cooperation that transformed how humans understood wildlife behavior. As the sun began its descent, Jake found fresh tracks near his cabin. The mother bear and her cub had performed their regular inspection of the area. Their prints told a story of strength and adaptation, of wild creatures choosing to work with humans while maintaining their essential nature. The partnership they had forged had created a model for conservation that balanced protection with freedom. The evening light painted the mountains in gold as Jake completed his rounds. The mother bear and her cub appeared briefly on a distant ridge, their silhouettes powerful against the sunset. They had shown him that true wildlife protection required more than just human oversight. It needed trust, understanding, and cooperation between species. The next generation of rangers would learn from their example, though few would know the full story of how this partnership began. The mother bear's trust in Jake had sparked a transformation in conservation practices that would continue to evolve and grow, protecting wild creatures for generations to come. As darkness settled over Yellowstone, Jake reflected on how far they had come. The simple act of saving a bear cub had led to a revolution in wildlife protection, creating a legacy that would endure long after the original participants had passed into legend. The partnership between a ranger and a bear had shown the world that true conservation required the active participation of all species. In the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing through the valleys. The sound carried the promise of a future where humans and wildlife could work together to preserve the natural world. The mother bear and her cub had helped create this future, their story becoming part of the greater narrative of wildlife conservation. The stars emerged above Yellowstone, watching over a park that had become more than just a protected wilderness. It was now a living example of how trust between species could transform conservation efforts, creating a model for wildlife protection that would continue to evolve and inspire future generations of guardians. 2 years had passed since Jake's first encounter with the bear cub in the river. Yellowstone had blossomed under the new protection protocols, becoming a shining example of how humans and wildlife could coexist in harmony. The partnership that began with a simple act of courage had grown into a movement that transformed wildlife conservation across the nation. The morning sun painted the mountains in familiar gold as Jake prepared for another day of patrol. His role had evolved. He now trained new rangers in the innovative protection methods that had emerged from his experiences. The mother bear and her cub had become living legends in the park, though only Jake and a select few knew the full extent of their contribution. During his morning rounds, Jake visited the river where it all began. Fresh tracks in the mud showed that the mother bear had been there recently, still maintaining her vigilant presence in the park. Her cub, now a fully grown bear, had established its own territory nearby, carrying forward the remarkable intelligence and awareness its mother had taught. The success of Yellowstone's program had exceeded all expectations. The cooperative conservation model, as it had come to be known, had been adopted by wildlife preserves around the world. Animals everywhere demonstrated an ability to work with human protectors while maintaining their wild nature, creating a balance that benefited all species. Near midday, Jake encountered the mother bear near one of the monitoring stations. She acknowledged him with the same dignified awareness that had characterized their partnership from the beginning. Though they no longer needed to work as closely together, their connection remained, a testament to the trust that had developed between them. The park's protection systems had become a model of efficiency, combining technology with natural behavior patterns. Animals regularly interacted with the security installations, creating a network of surveillance that far exceeded what humans alone could achieve. The mother bear's example had shown that wildlife could be active participants in their own protection. As afternoon approached, Jake led a training session for new rangers. He shared the principles of cooperative conservation, teaching them to recognize and respect signs of animal intelligence. Though he never revealed the full story of his partnership with the bears, their influence could be seen in every aspect of the park's operations. The scientific community had documented remarkable changes in wildlife behavior under the new protection protocols. Animals displayed increased natural behaviors, higher survival rates, and more successful breeding patterns. The trust between species had created an environment where wildlife could truly thrive. During his evening patrol, Jake discovered fresh evidence of the continuing partnership between rangers and wildlife. The mother bear had led her new cubs, a second litter born in the safety of the protected park, on an inspection of the security systems. The next generation was already learning the delicate balance between wild nature and human protection. As the sun set over Yellowstone, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The simple act of saving a bear cub had sparked a revolution in wildlife conservation, creating a legacy that would protect wild creatures for generations to come. The mother bear's trust had shown the world that true conservation required cooperation between all species. The stars emerged above the park, watching over a wilderness transformed by trust and understanding. The mother bear and her offspring had helped create a future where humans and wildlife could work together to preserve the natural world. Their story had become part of something greater, a new chapter in the ongoing story of conservation. In the distance, a wolf's howl echoed through the valleys, joined by the calls of other creatures. The sound carried the promise of a future where all species could thrive together, protected by the partnership that had begun with one ranger's courage and one bear's trust. The mother bear appeared one final time on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the evening sky. She had shown Jake, and through him the world, that true wildlife protection required more than just human oversight. It needed the active participation of all creatures who called the wilderness home. As darkness settled over Yellowstone, Jake knew that their story would continue to inspire future generations of wildlife guardians. The partnership between a ranger and a bear had created a model for conservation that balanced protection with freedom, showing that the most effective guardians of nature were those who understood the power of trust between species. The legacy they had created would endure, protecting the wild creatures of Yellowstone and beyond for years to come. And somewhere in the vast wilderness, a mother bear continued her vigilant watch, a living symbol of the extraordinary partnership that had transformed wildlife conservation forever. Dear listeners, we hope the extraordinary journey of Jake and the mother bear has touched your hearts and opened your eyes to the amazing possibilities that exist when humans and wildlife work together in harmony. This story of trust, courage, and cooperation shows us that nature's greatest guardians are those who understand and respect the delicate balance of the wild. If you've been moved by this tale of partnership and protection, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us share more inspiring stories of wildlife conservation and the dedicated people who work to protect our natural world. Join us in the comments below to share your thoughts and experiences with wildlife protection. Together, we can create a future where all creatures thrive in harmony with nature. Don't miss our upcoming stories of hope, courage, and the extraordinary connections between humans and wildlife. Until next time, keep watching and keep protecting our precious natural world.